Inspired by Dau's hometown in northern Michigan and its proximity to Wallen Lake, where Ernest Hemingway spent much time and derived inspiration from, the prize promotes emerging voices and spotlights the next generation of fiction writers. Tonight, we have the pleasure of being joined by Sindya Bhanoo, one of the judges for the 2024 prize and our emcee for the evening. Sindya Bhanoo is the author of the short story collection, Seeking Fortune Elsewhere. She is the winner of an Oregon Book Award for fiction, the New American Voices Award, and an O. Henry Prize. She lives in Corvallis, Oregon, and teaches creative writing at Oregon State University. Tonight, you'll hear the prize-winning stories, which range from tales of an eccentric billionaire who commissions the embalming of a blue whale to reflections on the challenges of addiction and the long legacy of the Great Migration. Where they range in subject matter, they are unified by themes of childhood, innocence, ignorance, and escape. They expose essential truths and challenge us to see beyond our comfort zones. I'll turn it over to Sindya to introduce our first writer.
Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and I look forward to settling in and listening to these wonderful writers read. As Valentine said, this prize recognizes writers for their debut short story published in a literary magazine. The other two judges, Sadiq Fofana, Achigal Savas, and I, kept this in mind as we read the thick packet of submissions given to us. We considered the literary merit and strength of each story that was submitted, but we also considered promise. We, the judges, are three different people, different writers with different styles and different tastes. Also, I should say, we were at all times in three vastly different time zones when we were doing this. During our first meeting to discuss the submissions, I was in India, Aishigal was in Paris, and Sadiq was in New York City. But we managed to meet, and together we selected stories that moved us, stories that made us laugh and cry, and stories with indelible images and characters. And we also believe that the writers we selected will bring us many more stories, that their particular perspective on the human experience is important and necessary. Tonight, we celebrate exceptional writers and their writing, and we also raise a toast to the great art by these writers that is yet to come. Our first reader tonight is Josie Abugov, a fiction writer and journalist from Los Angeles. She works as an environmental reporter at the Times-Picayune in New Orleans. She graduated from Harvard in 2023, where she won the Leigh Barron Russell Briggs Fiction Prize for Best Undergraduate Story. Now here's Josie.
Hi. This is Daisy the Whale. Thank you. One morning when I was 10 years old, on the second day of summer in 1938, I looked out my window and saw a dead whale lying in our backyard. I already knew her as Daisy, and I could smell her all the way from my bedroom on the second floor. I ran down the stairs and into the yard, where Dad stood in his work clothes directing a crew of men to move Daisy into the back corner of our 1-acre yard, the corner farthest from the house. I'd visited Daisy at San Pedro before. In April, Dad's boss, Mr. Johnson, had hired some guys to go whale hunting, which wasn't considered cruel back then. They caught the biggest one they could find, and they kept all 45 feet of her on the San Pedro pier for a few months while they started to embalm her. This was all part of Dad's job. He was a scientist, but on the day I was born, when the nurse asked him for his occupation, he said, "I am an inventor. My birth certificate under father occupation reads inventor." They kept Daisy on the pier for 2 months. Every day, crowds would gather and take photographs and watch Dad drain Daisy of her bile and blood and other liquids, and then wince as he injected bucketfuls of embalming fluid into the crevices of her body. The whole thing smelled like eggs and chemicals. Sometime in mid-May, Dad got a call from the sheriff, who said he was going to fine Dad and the crew because they didn't have a license to embalm a blue whale on public property. So Dad called up Mr. Johnson, this white man he met in Arizona, the one who financed his scientific projects. For a whole lot of money from the city, Mr. Johnson had promised to fully embalm a blue whale that would stand at the entrance of the brand new County Science Museum. The museum gave Mr. Johnson official supervision of the project, but Dad did all the brain work. Mr. Johnson told Dad that getting a public license like that was one big scam and the sheriff was a real oaf, so not to worry, it would be no problem. However, Mr. Johnson couldn't relocate Daisy to his own house because it was on the top of a cliff in Malibu. Even if they managed to get Daisy up there, she'd probably roll back into the ocean. But he would send over a big tow truck so Dad could pick her up and move her to our backyard in Alhambra, which was just a little town back then. For 5 days, Dad anticipated the tow truck's arrival in front of our house, but he was too nervous to tell Mom. Honey, I'm dropping off a 60,000-pound whale in our backyard for who knows how long. Can you imagine? Mom would have had a fit. When Mr. Johnson's truck finally arrived at the crack of dawn on that second day of summer, Mom was fast asleep. Dad had been pacing around the house since 4:30, full of whale-induced anxiety. Dad woke up my half-brother, Will, and took him on the drive to San Pedro that morning. Will was in high school then, but he was always skipping class to go around with friends of his in LA. Dad was trying to teach him a lesson about discipline, and I guess he thought a sunrise whale collecting trip demonstrated the kind of grit he wanted his teenage son to have. It was still dark when they took Mr. Johnson's tow truck all the way down to the pier. I do wonder what that drive was like, because the two of them, Dad and Will, turned out to be very mysterious men. Will had one child with a high school sweetheart, but she moved to New Mexico when the kid was a baby. Will never mentioned his son, at least not to me. He went looking for them, of course, but as far as I knew, he never saw them again. And Dad always said he was born in Dayton, Ohio, but at his funeral, my Aunt Adele told me he grew up in Chicago. But back then, everyone lied about themselves. I shouldn't say that they lied, they just chose what they wanted to tell you and didn't include the unhappy stuff. No one ever talked to children about the racial things, and it wasn't something you would ask. That didn't mean you didn't know. Of course we knew. In any case, Dad and Will came back with Daisy, and the other men arrived later that morning. As soon as I saw her, I dashed down the stairs. I was the youngest kid in my primary school class and very shy back then, but I was always happiest when it was summertime and I could be home with my family, playing in the backyard with our baby chicks and the piglets. Daisy was the cherry on top. But then I looked at Mom's face. Even as a child, I could tell she was seething. Not that she could say anything right then. Like I said, it was a different time. Women were different. No, that's not right. They were the same, felt the same, knew the same stuff, but just couldn't say it all the time. That's not right either. Once when I was little and I couldn't fall asleep, I stepped outside and Mom was drinking dark liquor and reading the biggest book I'd ever seen. Whenever we'd complain about going to mass or waiting at the salon while she got her hair pressed, she'd always say, "There's no such thing as boring things, only boring people." She read the California Eagle and the Los Angeles Times every morning on the porch with a coffee and a cigarette. She left Louisiana when she was 20 with her 6 sisters and one brother because they couldn't get a library card down there. There were other reasons too, but the point is, once a blue whale is already in your backyard, there's not so much you can do about it. They put a big tent over Daisy, and the men left in Mr. Johnson's truck. For a while after that, maybe a week or so, she just sat there. Dad and the crew, and sometimes Mr. Johnson, worked all day under the tent embalming her, just like they did at San Pedro, only it wasn't some kind of performance for crowds of people. Mom stayed angry with Dad for days after Daisy arrived. When she brought him his dinner plate, she'd smack it down on the table. He liked his coffee with milk and sugar, so she'd bring it to him black. And she pretended the whale wasn't there. Back at the pier, she always seemed so curious about Daisy. She used to walk up close enough to hear the fruit flies buzzing in the folds of Daisy's belly. She'd narrow her eyes, then look up and widen them, as if she were standing in front of a great piece of art. Once, Mom took out her right hand and laid her palm on Daisy's stomach. One of the guys in the crew yelled at her to step back, lady, because he didn't know she was the boss's wife. Here in the backyard, Daisy obstructed the 1 acre of space that Mom had. "If the whole backyard is now your office," she said to Dad over dinner, "then maybe I'll start spending my days on the beach in Malibu or off on sailboats hunting whales." When Dad didn't respond to this, she added, "She's gonna kill the grass." But after a while, Mom's annoyance started to subside. I think she'd forgotten she actually liked having Dad around. She was used to eating breakfast with me in the morning, tending to the animals in the garden, driving into LA to see her sisters and the ladies she knew from Louisiana, spending a lot of time with her thoughts. I don't mean she was lonely, more that she liked to think but never grew up with the time to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Josie. That was wonderful. Our next reader is Annie Barnett. Annie got her start writing fiction at the UCLA Extension Writers Program and is a winner of the James Kirkwood Literary Prize. She lives in Los Angeles with her husband. Now here's Annie.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much to everyone for being here and to everyone who made this anthology and this event happen. This is my first reading. I'm thrilled and grateful. I'll be reading from a story called What Child Is This? It's a story. I have to set this up a little bit because I'm reading a little not from right from the beginning, but it's narrated by Jane. She has a 6-year-old son with something called sensory processing disorder, a condition that affects how a person experiences the world, often in difficult ways, and it can be very stressful for families. It is for Jane and her family. And this story takes place over a stressful day. And one of the stressful events is that Jane's in-laws have flown into town. They've flown in to see their grandson perform in the school play. And it's a private school. They are funding the school, paying for it, hoping it will improve his behavior. And after the play, they want to go to Morton's for dinner. That's part of the tradition. Okay. The play does not go as planned. The grandparents are Dr. Smith and Elaine Smith, and then Alan is Jane's husband, and Aiden is their son. Vice President O'Malley holds the door to Larimer Hall open for us. As we pass over the threshold, I hear Mrs. King saying over the microphone, "Well, that was not on script." The heavy door closes on relieved laughter. Aiden reaches towards the closed door, kicking his father, who's trying hard to hold on to him. "I want to go back," he screams. His words echo off the grand campus's stone buildings and courtyard. "You can't," Alan cries. "Damn it, Aiden, there are some things you do and that's it. You can't go back." "Alan, the whole school can hear you," Mrs. Smith is loud whispering. Dr. Smith, whose nerves have been steeled by decades of obstetric emergencies, is reading a plaque that explains the history of Larimer Hall of the Performing Arts, his hands in the pockets of his khakis. "I'm not going to keep saying this. It's time," he says, still reading, "to move on from the sensory processing nonsense and get a legitimate diagnosis from a legitimate physician, not some quack." "We'll discuss this over dinner," Mrs. Smith says. "Alan, Jane, get him under control so we can go." Dr. Smith finally turns away from the plaque and says, "I'm not convinced it isn't a matter of discipline. Perhaps our money would be better spent in military school." "Dad, he's 6, Alan says. To my horror, Alan begins to cry. "Okay, Aiden, calm down for grandmother. It's time to go to the restaurant." "For Christ's sake, Elaine," I say, "we're not going to Morton's." Dr. and Mrs. Smith escape to their rental car, and we manage to get Aiden into his booster seat in the 4Runner. Alan sits beside him in the back, trying to calm him down. It's not working. Aiden kicks the back of my seat, the thumps registering with a surprising force. He is tired, but relentless. "Please, please, give me, Daddy. Let me try again." Alan is holding at Aiden's angel costume in his lap. "Don't be afraid." That's his line that he had in the play. "See, Mommy, let me try again." A blast of cold air hits when Alan rolls the window down. He lets the angel costume unfurl in the wind like a white flag of surrender before releasing it. I check the mirror and see it land in a heap of dirty snow. The sounds Aiden makes. They sink heavy into my chest, and they have me confused. I have to check the next street sign because even on these familiar roads, for a moment, I can't tell what direction we're heading in. Alan stares out the window. I'm surprised by what he's done, but I understand. Aiden will, God willing, get another chance at many things in life. But being an angel with a speaking line in the Denver Day School holiday pageant is not one of them. Sometimes you can't go back. We absorb the truth of this in the reverberations of Aiden's screams. From 6 years of experience, we know that keeping a tired Aiden contained in his car seat and taking a drive is the best way to knock him out. So we drive along I-25, which could take us on our way to the mountains if we wanted to go, past Washington Park, where we used to drink wine on lazy summer days, through Cherry Creek, where all the nice houses are, and finally back to our house. We idle in the driveway, not able to bear waking our son. I noticed that my husband has put the electric Christmas candles in our windows. You better turn that candle off in Aiden's room before we get upstairs, I whisper, staring into its peaceful glow. He's had it on all night for 3 nights. You're kidding me. You put these up 3 nights ago? I hadn't noticed. Jane, I can barely hear him. I don't want to go home yet. So we don't. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Next, I'd like to welcome Jason Baum, reading from his short story, Rocket. Jason was born and raised in the East Bay area. His fiction has appeared in Bellevue Literary Review, and he was longlisted for a Master's Review Winter Short Story Award for New Writers. He's currently working on his debut novel and stories. Welcome, Jason.
All right. Yeah, like Annie said, we really appreciate you all putting this on. This is really special. And I think Suzanne McConnell, the editor for Bellevue, who played a big part in the success of this story, is here tonight. So hello, Suzanne, and I'm going to read from Rocket. All right, here we go. The only meth head I ever really liked was this guy everybody called T-Rex. We both collected old sci-fi comics and we hated rehabs. He was one of the regulars at the AA fellowship I'd been going to, and despite all his best efforts, he could never string together more than a few weeks clean. His nickname T-Rex wasn't because he was some ferocious carnivore or anything. It's just that his arms were abnormally thin in proportion to the rest of his bulky body, like a tyrannosaur. And I think his real name was Kelly. One night while I'm cleaning the fellowship bathrooms, I overhear people talking about T-Rex. Nobody had seen him in a few weeks, which usually meant one of the 3 relapse inevitabilities, that you're in jail, you're in rehab, or you're dead. And that's the saying around here, whether you're a drinker or a drugger. But then this guy who's always sleeping on the couch says that it wasn't any of those things. It's just that T-Rex was building a rocket in his backyard. Like a missile? Somebody asks. No, like a ship, the guy says. He's building a rocket ship. Well, where the hell does he think he's going? One guy barks. Yeah, T-Rex can barely read. How's he going to build a rocket ship? This woman says. I keep scrubbing at the grout between the tiles while the debate outside the bathroom carries on about what T-Rex did and didn't know about spaceflight. It's hard to know what to believe around this place. Everybody's sober, but they still goof off and exaggerate in a belligerent, I'm going to one you up sort of way. Instead of drinking contest, everybody's always like, oh yeah, well, I drank 5 gallons of whiskey a day. Or, big deal, I shot 2 pounds of dope in one sitting. Or, yeah, well, that's nothing, I've died and come back to life 26 times. So you have to investigate everything you hear if you want to get to the truth. And when I'm done with the sink tiles, I turn on the hot faucet and rinse the sponge out, and I leave the water running. You have to get it scalding if you're going to make a dent in this place. Half measures availed us nothing. That's one of my favorites. They have all kinds of those sayings up on the walls, first things first and 24 hours at a time. I take those can recoveryisms really serious because I don't want to end up in jail and dead or in jail, in rehab, or dead. I want the happy, joyous, and free that everybody else has. That saying is front and center above the fellowship door. When the water is hot enough to blister, I soak a Brillo pad and I add some bleach and I start in on the toilets. The whole time I'm thinking about T-Rex going into space. We'd worked the steps during one of his more earnest stretches of sobriety, and I'd watched him struggle to get through one page of the big book. No, in hindsight, now I'm wondering if he'd been faking it just to get out of doing the hard work. Addicts and alcoholics will pull your leg clean off of it if you let them. I catch myself doing it all the time. A couple days later on Saturday, I stopped by the trailer park where T-Rex lives to see for myself what he's been up to. Gathering evidence has been critical in my first year of sobriety. I have to see something with my own eyes, and it helps me sort out what's real and what's not. But then as soon as I park my car, I see that rocket. It's school bus sized, and it fills the empty lot next to the trailer park. It looks like one you'd see in a 1950s B movie with a bright red nose cone on top, and it's standing on 4 matching red fins at the bottom. The steel body has one circular window on the side, and several side panels are laying on the ground, leaving all the wires and cables poking out from the ship's insides. I walk over to where T-Rex and this guy in a white lab coat are standing in front of a rocket and a giant whiteboard with mathematical equations scribbled on it. And T-Rex is all worked up, pointing at the rocket with his reptile arms, and he's shouting about something called the orbital trim maneuver, and he's telling the guy, you're not taking into account the speed of millimeters versus meters per second. And the guy in the white lab coat throws up his arms in frustration, and he says, no, it's mass and propellant, mass and propellant. I wonder to myself if T-Rex is even clean. You know, with meth heads, it's really hard to tell. And looking at his weathered, pockmarked face, you'd guess he's in his late 50s, but I know really he's somewhere in his mid-30s like me. And plus, meth does a number on the central nervous system, and none of the telltale spasms ever really go away, and T-Rex's little arms always twitch like he's about to punch you. And he makes this weird clicking noise with his tongue. Sometimes his eyes will do this violent blink like the lids are being yanked down over and over. And every time I'm around T-Rex, I'm reminded of how they told me that the doctors can only draw blood from my left arm because all the years of shooting junk and oxy left the veins in my right arm shot to hell forever. The doctor actually used the word forever. And then finally T-Rex stops mid-sentence and he turns to me with a grin and his tongue clicking. And he says, hey man, how's it going? And I say, I'm just stopping by. I tell him I hadn't seen you around. I know, he says apologetically. I'm working on something. And I whistle in awe at that rocket and I say, she sure is a beauty. Where'd you get her? And he says, I know a guy, which is believable considering the resourcefulness of meth heads. There's nothing in the world they can't find. And even if they couldn't, they'd know somebody who could. And where are you going? I ask him. And he says, nowhere really. I'm just going to drift in orbit for a year or so and get some real clean time. And I will stop right there. And again, thank you all so much for putting this on.
Thank you, Jason. Zkara Gaillard earned their BA in English from the University of South Carolina and their MA in fiction from the Iowa Writers Workshop, alongside a graduate certificate in African American Studies. They live in New York City. Zkara is reading from A Good Word, first published in Transition magazine.
Thank you. What you need to know about this story is that it follows 5 siblings who are staying with their grandparents over a summer. Tamar, Grandma called out. My sister came back through the doorway. Y'all can go outside and feed the chickens. Make sure it's okay with Mrs. Rudine. Maybe go and feed the chickens, ma'am, Tamar asked. Mrs. Rudine nodded. Y'all know where the feed is at. My hand stopped in the jar. I thought if I didn't move, they would forget I was in the kitchen with them. Rhoda, this is grown folk talk. Grandma turned to me. Go on. Yes, ma'am. I grabbed the cookie I had my hand on and put the lid back on the jar. I walked slowly to the back door, trying to think of a way to stay inside the house. I stood in the living room, but they were quiet. I walked to the storm door, pushed it open, and let it slam against the frame, then crouched by the wall that blocked the kitchen from the living room. You better than me, raising kids twice. Mrs. Rudine scoffed like she had heard a bad joke. At least they ain't babies. We're happy to look after them until Diane gets back on her feet. Grandma sounded strange, like she was faking a smile. The minute that good-for-nothing husband of hers left, she should have come back down. If it had been Sandra in the situation, me and Earl would have went and dragged her back here if that's what it took. Ma, Aunt Sandra sounded embarrassed. I'm just saying, she shit the bed, let the girl lie in it. I hear you, Grandma said, but what's done is done. They were all quiet for a moment. I looked at the cookie in my hand, oatmeal raisin, and waited for them to say more. They were so quiet that I thought they could hear me breathing. I don't think Grandma had ever been so quiet. Maybe she didn't like Mrs. Rudine either. I was about to go outside when I heard Aunt Sandra. Aunt won't talk about what happened. He don't want me to be scared, but I think not knowing is scarier than anything else. Did they find out who it was? Mrs. Rudine asked. Grandma cleared her throat. It was Gina Collins' boy. The AC rumbled so loudly I almost couldn't hear what they were saying. I moved closer to the kitchen door. The light of the kitchen shined a rectangle of brightness into the dark living room. I made sure not to step into the light. Tyson? No, the younger one, Darnell. Aunt and Darnell played football together in high school, Aunt Sandra whispered. That's his friend. Mrs. Rudine groaned. What happened? Aunt Sandra asked. Grandma kept talking. He'd been working at the coke plant with some white boys. Guess he thought they was friends and all. Went drinking with them down at the bars down a ways. Must have said something them white boys didn't like, Mrs. Rudine muttered under her breath. Don't take nothing but a change in the breeze to set him off. Grandma sounded annoyed. You know that. You right, Aunt Sandra said. Then what? They strung that boy up, tied his arms to a tree, beat him to death's door, cut his face up. Grandma sighed. He couldn't even open his eyes, let alone say his own name. Goosebumps moved from my arms, spread down my back, and went through my legs. Mrs. Rudine made a noise in the back of her throat. A damn shame. Who found him? Aunt Sandra asked. Maggie's grandson. They dropped him in the yard, rope still around his neck. Lord of mercy, Aunt Sandra gasped, that poor baby. She's the one who called us. Henry couldn't sleep. He just sat there with the gun all night. What did you do? Mrs. Rudine asked. I stayed with him the whole night, Grandma scoffed. Tried to keep the kids in, but you know how they get. Don't listen to nobody, Aunt Sandra chuckled a little. Ain't been a lynching here in at least a decade. Why now? I wasn't sure if Grandma really wanted the answer. Mrs. Rudine clicked her teeth in disagreement. If lynching ain't a good word for it, then what is? Grandma asked. I don't know, but that's a strong word for it. It's the only word for it, Grandma said. The frosting on the cookie was sticky in my fingers. I felt sick. I wanted to throw the cookie away, but I didn't want to go back into the kitchen. I heard Aunt Sandra start another question, but I didn't want to hear any more. I stood and walked through the storm door, placing it back gently. The yard wasn't as overgrown as the front, but still longer than Pop kept it at our house. The chicken coop was on one side and the shed was on the other. There wasn't a fence or anything blocking off the woods that started behind their house. I found my brothers and sisters next to the chicken coop. You gonna eat that? Moses asked when I walked up beside him. I shook my head and gave him the cookie. I wiped my clammy hands against my jeans. The chickens clucked excitedly, racing to eat the feed that Mariah and Tamar had sprinkled on the ground. Uriah danced around the fence, making silly noises as if he could talk to them. I tried to laugh along with them, opening my mouth and closing it again. I thought about whether I should tell them what I heard. Maybe not everyone. Maybe just Tamar. She would know what to do. Tamar, I called out to her. Yeah? Tamar glanced up at me for a second, but then she pointed her finger to the other side of the yard. We turned around and saw Pop, Uncle Aunt, and Mr. Earl standing over something in the woods behind the house. My brothers sprinted over. The rest of us were close behind them. Within a few feet, we could see what it was. It was a deer. They had hung it from the branches of the tree with a bunch of rope. Its top legs were tied back, and its head lay limp to the side like its neck was broken. The eyes were big and brown and lifeless. I didn't like how human its eyes were. I didn't like how much different than human eyes they were. Even with the heat, goosebumps raised on my arms. I looked away. I could see patches of lavender sky between the leafy branches of the trees. It seemed darker than it was before as we stood in front of the dead animal. Did you shoot it? I asked. My brothers walked to get a better look. Mr. Earl took out a knife from his belt and pointed it with it. The legs broke. Then what happened? Moses asked. Why is it dead? A car hit it and left it in the road, Mr. Earl answered, as if he hadn't ever heard a stupider question. Mariah took a step back. Why is it in the yard, though? Mr. Earl didn't answer. It's off season, Uncle Aunt said, then grunted as he bent and laid out pieces of blue tarp beneath the animal. He stood and straightened his baseball cap. It's illegal to kill a deer right now. Without any warning, Mr. Earl placed his knife at the bottom of the deer and ran it all the way up its body. Pop and Uncle Aunt helped hold the deer's lower legs in place as he made the cuts. We all stood in silent horror as Mr. Earl reached his hands inside and started to pull things out. No use in wasting good meat. First, it was the smell, thick and coppery. I coughed on it like a mouthful of pennies. Then the stomach fell out, and with it came the corn, grass, and nuts the deer must have last eaten. It smelled nasty and woodsy and sweet at the same time. Mr. Earl kept pulling stuff out. It all landed on the tarp with soft plopping sounds. I looked back into the eyes of the deer, big and brown, empty, flat. Every time Mr. Earl touched it, I swear I saw it flinch. And even though I knew it couldn't be true, I felt like it was still alive somehow, that it was in pain. All right, Mr. Earl stood and wiped the back of his hand against his sweaty face. leaving a red mark across his forehead. I stared down at the pile of the deer's insides and wonder how big a pile of my own insides would be if someone was to cut me open. I'll pull the truck around. Uncle Ant walked off to the front of the house. Pop and Mr. Earl gathered the tarps. After dumping it in some bags, they walked to the hose on the side of the house to rinse off their knives. We stood looking at the deer. Its entire body opened up and hollowed out. My stomach felt funny. Moses crept close to the deer, reaching out a finger to touch it. Dare me? Stop it, Tamar said. You're all punks. Moses poked the deer. He walked around the tree, making faces like he was scared as he went. He picked up a twig and weighed it in his hand. What do you call a deer with no eyes? He pointed the stick at each of us as he waited for an answer. Moses, I'm going to go tell Pop and Grandma if you don't stop, Tamar warned, but her voice shook. Moses stabbed the stick through the deer's eye. The eye burst, and this thick, bloody stuff came running down the deer's neck. He laughed and stabbed the other eye. My nose pricked and my eyes got hot. I have no idea. Moses spun around to face us and continued laughing. Thank you.
Thank you, Zkara. Such powerful readings so far. We have two more writers that we'll hear from. Leanne Ma is next. She will read from a story called Guilty Parties. Leanne received an MFA in fiction from UMass Boston. Her work has been published in Salamander and Gulf Coast and nominated for a Pushcart Prize. Originally from Hong Kong, she now lives in Brooklyn, New York.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here tonight. Thanks for attending. So I'm going to be reading from Guilty Parties, and I'm going to start at the beginning. Every Monday morning before school, we assembled in class lines in the covered playground from shortest to tallest. On the first day of second grade, we were the four shortest girls in class: Angie, Bernadette, Clara, and Denise. A large rickety fan whirred above the principal's head on the lectern as she delivered morning announcements, but we were too short to feel the breeze. Beyond the iron gate, a double-decker bus rumbled down Bonham Road, shaking the cement beneath our snug Mary Janes. Flapping our sticky white cheap house-style uniform dresses to cool our blazing bodies, we swallowed saliva to quench our dry throats, impatient to chant the only words we knew to the school song. Glory, glory, St. Teresa's girls live forever. But when the announcements ended, the school song did not play. Instead, four tall upper grade girls marched up to the front of the playground, two of them with long flags tucked under their armpits. Working in pairs, they hooked the flags onto the two poles next to the lectern. An unfamiliar tune started playing, and the flags were thrust into the air, unfurling the 5-star red flag of China and the red-white Bahenia flower flag of Hong Kong. The flags were hoisted up at the same time, slowly, and by the last note of the song, they reached the top of the pole, blowing robustly in the fan's current. It was the most solemn event we'd ever witnessed. We wondered when we would grow tall enough to hoist the flags ourselves. What was the meaning of this new ceremony? We looked quizzically at each other. We couldn't remember. Everything was different in the second grade. We were a British colony, a voice behind us said. Natalie, we later learned her name, had a chubby face, dark bushy brows, and large thoughtful eyes. Her hair was tightly wound into pigtails tied with pink ribbons. We were given back to China on July 1st. No, we weren't, we said, though we didn't know why. Maybe because we didn't like that she used a big word, colony, that we didn't understand. Maybe we didn't like to think that we were given back to anybody. Maybe we didn't like to think that Natalie, who was the 5th shortest in class, sounded like a self-righteous adult and knew something we didn't. Finally, the school song started playing. Yes, we were. For 99 years, my father told me. A blush lit up on her cheeks like a light bulb, as though she needed energy to power through her shyness. Why didn't she just keep her thoughts to herself? We didn't understand how long 99 year was. What came after 99? We forgot, but we weren't going to ask the new girl. Instead, we said in a voice mimicking her self-satisfaction, "You're not allowed to wear pink ribbons in your hair. Red or black plastic ties only." Just then, one of the student monitors came over and pulled the 5 of us out of line. She marched us across the playground, past the lectern, in front of the entire assembly of watchful eyes as the loudspeakers belted out, "Glory, glory!" In the musty classroom, we were written up for detention and told to write, "I will not chat during school assembly 100 times. 100, that's what came after 99. When we finished copying out the lines, the student monitor supervising us was outside in the hallway. We swung our feet under the desks and looked at each other. We couldn't be more different. We had long and short hair, dark and porcelain skin, single and double eyelids, round gold rimmed glasses and perfect vision, flat and tall noses, baby and adult teeth. But the ache in our forearms from pressing pencil to paper pulsed with the same anger. It was all because of Natalie, who was still writing, her mouth twitching with concentration. Her white school uniform dress was so big that the chest had sunk to her waist, and her red tie looked like it had been pulled from her father's closet. The student monitor had given her a warning slip for the pink ribbons, and she'd taken them off. Untied hair was not allowed, but the yellow rubber bands tying up her hair, which she picked up off the classroom floor, still broke the rules. We wanted to be mad at her, but we also wanted to laugh. A girl like that couldn't be taken seriously. "What does your father do?" we asked. "He's a businessman." We exchanged wary glances. Our fathers were also businessmen. They made men's undergarments, carpets, stereos, and watches in Chinese factories, packaged them in Hong Kong, and shipped them off to the world. What if Natalie's father had made nicer watches or better underwear? Would our fathers lose their jobs? We would hate to become poor and have to work as cashiers at the Park and Shop supermarket, which seemed to be the moral of every cautionary tale told by our parents. Make money or else. What does he make? He makes teddy bears. Threat averted, we chuckled, wondering what the teddy bears looked like. We imagined snuggling up to the fuzzy belly of a giant Winnie the Pooh or Paddington bear, or throwing tea parties in our bedrooms for small honey brown bears on checkered picnic blankets with caramel popcorn. From that moment on, we welcomed Natalie to our group. Her rough edges could be pieced into our puzzle. We had extra uniform dresses that fit, a new bag of red plastic hairbands, a generosity for the less fortunate. She was our missing piece. We told ourselves we wanted to understand what a colony was. Who were we kidding? We wanted a free teddy bear. I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Leanne. Our final writer tonight is Ben Van Voorhis. Ben is a writer, editor, and musician from Santa Clarita, California. He holds an MFA in fiction from Eastern Washington University and is the former managing editor of Willow Springs. His writing has appeared in Nimrod, Salamander, and the Master's Review. He currently lives in Spokane, Washington, where he sometimes teaches at Gonzaga University. Here's Ben.
Just want to echo the thanks from some of the earlier readers for everybody who's attending this and everybody who put this on, specifically the folks at PEN America and Catapult. It means a lot. So I'm going to be reading from a story called Patience. I'm going to get a little crazy here and read the very last section. So all the information that you need to know going in here is our main character is a general who has been imprisoned on an island. And one of his jailers has put together an escape plan for the general and has let him in on it. A little after midnight, the general packed what little he thought he couldn't live without into a model knapsack, the insignia and blazoned knife he'd always carried as a commander on the field, a few books of physics and philosophy, and an English newspaper dated the previous month, a pocket watch, a set of reliable pens, and a water-scarred notebook, some letters, a small retractable brass telescope, and of course the box of Ptolemy playing cards from the study. Although, to be honest, he couldn't imagine playing Patience aboard a ship, the slick cards shifting around with the motion of the waves. Just to be sure, he packed the old, tattered deck as well. He thought a long time about whether to wear his regalia. It's hard to break a habit, after all, and how would the people receive him without it? Throughout the evening, the general had tried unsuccessfully to recall a sense of excitement or relief, and at first he thought it was the nerves getting to him, that he was just so anxious about the process of escape that he had no room for the prospect itself to sink in, that once he was through the second kitchen door, it would be smooth sailing. But something was off-center in him. He was thinking more and more about DeLuca having been cut as a child, and the traitor's body hanging in the wind, and what was forming instead of excitement was a vast pit. It was his tenderness for DeLuca, however, the gesture with the Ptolemy playing cards that made the general keep to the instructions laid out by the note, to don his regalia and make his way quietly out of the study and down the hall. The kitchen had 3 doors, one at the terminus of the hall adjacent to the foyer, one around the side just down the stairs from the study, and one around the back, which his attendants primarily used. Even at this hour there were guards, though he and they had been on this island so long without incident that complacency was the general rule, meaning there might be a couple, at most, posted in the foyer. Even so, he made sure to step light and carried the hickory cane at his side instead of supporting himself with it. As a consequence, he limped down the hall from the study, then down the side stairs leading to the kitchen door. He took small steps and shuffled with his bad foot to avoid setting off the floorboards and to prevent his regalia from making noise. Now he regretted having worn it. He felt silly and self-important and small. Partway down the stairs, he stopped, letting his eyes adjust to the moonbeams bathing the hall below. You could just see the kitchen door from this angle. No one was there. He checked his pocket watch, having to tilt it downward to catch the light through the windows, and saw he was right on time. Of course, the note hadn't specified which side of the door he needed to be on, and he suspected they'd leave from the kitchen anyway. There was an entrance to the storm cellar there, and tunnels you might take to retrieve grain or travel surreptitiously to different parts of the grounds. He went on, forgetting to skip the 5th step up. The moment his weight came down, the wood caterwauled like an infant, shrieking each way down the hall. It was a miracle the whole of Breton House didn't come alive then, soldiers descending on him like he was carrion. Heart thrashing, the general flicked through every possibility. That DeLuca would burst through the kitchen door and pull him dramatically to safety, that one of his attendants would come out to see what all the noise was about, that a pair of jailers would rush around the corner behind the stairs and spot him trying to make a break for it, in which case he'd have to come up with a story, sleepwalking, the early onset of senility, something like that. But nobody came, and his heartbeat evened, and then it was so quiet you could hear his pocket watch ticking away. The next step didn't creak, nor did the last few. At the kitchen door, the general paused. It was the wrong shape. He wouldn't have been able to explain why this thought occurred to him. It was the same door it had always been, deep brown and rectangular and embossed with 4 smaller rectangles, themselves embossed with twisting floral patterns and sporting a heavy brass knob that was dented on the left side and shone with dull moonlight. All the same, it was wrong. He wouldn't be able to fit through. Yes, but not because the door was the wrong shape. It was only him, tilted and out of proportion. Maybe a year ago, he might have been able to go through, maybe 2 years. It was hard to say when the change had occurred, or when he'd become aware of it. Maybe it wasn't a singular change, but the culmination of 10,000 changes, all stacked on top of one another. And maybe his noticing had been just as gradual, the disease of the shape which wouldn't allow him through the door. It would be so easy, wouldn't it? Just to grasp the knob, to turn and push and vanish, but then what? Would the people welcome him cheering, arms wide, or like an old lover having moved on without him? The world hadn't stopped turning in his exile, and neither had he. Maybe it didn't matter whether the door was the wrong shape or he was. DeLuca was waiting on the other side of it somewhere, and everyone who loved him and owed him nothing, and who loathed him with good reason, and every indifferent eye in the vast ocean. He turned away from the door and went a little way down the hall, where there was another door. In every respect, it was identical to the second kitchen door, the crucial difference being that it was the right shape for his body. He went out of the house and into the dark. At night, the trail on the scarp seemed shorter. He took a narrower path down the hill and out toward the ocean to avoid any sharp-eyed jailers, but the going felt easier, so much so that he didn't have to use his cane for maybe a half mile, and even then its heft supported him in a way he couldn't remember it having done before. It was cold, but the weight of his regalia kept his temperature up, and his joints didn't ache much, maybe just a shallow twinge of the spine. It was a full moon, so bright he could see every rock beneath his boots. He was probably a mile out then, almost to the bread knife inlet, when he noticed he was no longer wearing the knapsack. Maybe he dropped it along the trail without noticing, and it was lying somewhere half covered in dust and ants big as sugar cubes. Or maybe he'd left it just outside the second kitchen door that fit him wrong, or at the top of the stairs, or maybe it had never gone out of the study because he knew, even then, that he couldn't bring himself to leave. Which possibly had something to do with the feel of the tilted mahogany table under his weathered hands, the smell of sea-stripped playing cards. It wasn't out of love or fear. It wasn't a bad game he'd been dealt, only a static one. He couldn't judge whether he should die or not, guillotined or executed by firing squad, or live out the rest of his lonely days here, or be castrated. How could you say what you deserved? How could anyone? He came to the inlet now, and the tide was out. There was a gentle slope down the cliff. He stopped to take off his boots, socks before descending so he could feel the fine sand between his toes. You could hear the sound of the waves like a clock. He slid onto the beach and his cane sank into the ground unsteadily, so he ditched it. From near the low cliff, the flat seemed like it stretched out forever before hitting the water's edge. But he walked forward anyway, picturing the sand sprouting wildflowers everywhere laced with them. His limp now pronounced. His feet hurt and his back. They would never stop hurting, probably. As he went, he stripped first the jacket with its epaulets and clasps, then the iron-pressed trousers, his shirt sleeves and underthings. The air struck right through him, and goose pimples broke out all along his arms and the back of his neck. His hands shook and twitched. Sand dampened underfoot. Now his feet were coated with it, and the waves were close enough for him to make out the silver froth clearly, with the moon shining like that. And finally the water came up over his toes with a shock of cold. He stopped, catching his breath, naked in the shallows, imagining the schooner that was supposed to take him away to his old life or a new one, maybe sailing empty, northward, with a skeleton crew or no crew at all, a ghost ship creaking in the waves. He stood there without knowing what he was waiting for. Maybe nothing. Only that the sea broke around his ankles, that the wind was blowing, and the tide was starting to come back in. Thank you.
Let's give one more round of virtual applause for these fantastic writers, as well as Sindya and our lovely partners at Catapult. Thank you so much for attending and supporting these brilliant writers. If you found yourself moved by these stories and want to read the stories by the writers who are unable to attend tonight's event, I encourage you to pick up a copy of Best Debut Short Stories 2024, which is available wherever books are sold or at the link that I just sent you. Thank you again and have a lovely, lovely rest of your night.